All right, hey people, this is Chris Lucas. This is a random stream, so if you're watching this on replay, I'm just going to do some live Bible research and see how it goes. It might be real boring. I don't know. I'm just going to kind of plug some things into the AI and see what it says. I might just start a whole new AI chat. I'll just do a whole new one. Because I do want to study what the early church taught as far as like once saved always saved and all that stuff. Hopefully this is processing on Rumble. It says I'm supposed to be able to just click and start recording, so we'll see. Anyway, let's see here. What should I ask it? I'm just going to ask it stuff starting with probably free grace. I'm curious, before the 200 AD period of time, who taught this doctrine called free grace, where you believe in just 5 minutes of sincere faith and that you're basically always saved and you can not do anything to lose your salvation, including stop believing?
The doctrine of free grace, which emphasizes salvation through faith alone, without the necessity of good works or continued belief to maintain salvation, has roots that can be traced back to the early church. However, it was not systematized in the form we know today until much later. In the early church, there were unnamed individuals criticized by Augustine who held views similar to free grace, believing that one is saved by faith alone and that God's future judgment for Christians consisted only of temporal punishment and reward, excluding the possibility of hell. They argued that deeds such as repentance and good works were not necessary to enter heaven at one. The modern form of free grace theology, as systematized in the 1980s by theologians like Charles Ryrie and Zane Hodges, has its roots in the soteriology formulated by many dispensational theologians. 1. This form of soteriology was coined with the title Free Grace by Zane Hodges. 1. Before the year 280, the doctrine was not as explicitly defined as it is today, but elements of it can be seen in the teachings of various theologians throughout history. For example, Pseudo-Chrysostom, 6th century, held a view similar to some free grace theologians, suggesting that those who do not obey will be in the kingdom but not reign with Christ. 1. It's important to note that while the core idea of salvation by faith alone has been present in Christian thought for centuries, the specific doctrine of free grace, particularly the aspect that one cannot lose their salvation even if they stop believing, was developed and systematized much later in history. The early church had a variety of views on salvation, and it was a topic of much debate and development over the centuries.
So, who can I read in early Christianity to see this doctrine taught that repentance and good works were not necessary to enter heaven?
In early Christianity, the doctrine that repentance and good works were not necessary to enter heaven was not a mainstream teaching, and most early Christian theologians emphasized the importance of both faith and works in salvation. However, there were some figures and movements that leaned towards the idea of salvation by faith alone. One such figure is Apostle Paul, who is often cited for his teachings on salvation by faith, particularly in his letters to the Romans and Galatians. While Paul does not dismiss the value of good works, he emphasizes that they are not the basis for salvation. Another notable theologian is Augustine of Hippo, who had a complex view on grace, free will, and predestination. Augustine affirmed the necessity of grace for salvation and argued against the Pelagian view that human effort could achieve salvation without divine grace. 2. For a more direct examination of early Christian views that align with the concept of salvation by faith without the necessity of works, you might explore the writings of the Antinomian movement, although they were considered heretical by the mainstream church. It's important to note that while some individuals or groups may have held beliefs similar to the free grace doctrine, these views were not widely accepted or taught as Orthodox Christianity in the early church. The early church fathers generally taught a balance between faith and works, with an emphasis on the transformative power of grace leading to a life of righteousness and repentance. For a deeper understanding of early Christian thought on salvation, you might consider reading primary sources from early church fathers like Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, and Polycarp of Smyrna, who were among the earliest to write about Christian doctrine after the apostles I. Their writings provide insight into the beliefs and teachings of the early Christian communities.
Who were some of these people in the antinomian movement?
The Antinomian movement, also known as the Free Grace Controversy, was a significant religious and political conflict in the Massachusetts Bay Colony during the 17th century. Some of the notable figures in this movement were Anne Hutchinson, a key figure in the controversy. She held meetings in her home where she discussed and criticized the colony's ministers for preaching a covenant of works rather than the covenant of grace I. Reverend John Wheelwright, Hutchinson's brother-in-law, he was also a prominent advocate of the free grace doctrine, too. Governor Henry Vane the Younger, he supported Hutchinson and Wheelwright's views and was involved in the early stages of the controversy, too. These individuals were part of a larger group of Puritan Christians who believed in the primacy of God's grace over good deeds for salvation. The dispute centered around the importance of a covenant of grace over a covenant of works, challenging the civil authority of the Boston magistrates over religious matters I. The controversy eventually led to the banishment of Anne Hutchinson and John Wheelwright from the Massachusetts Bay Colony I.
So, are there any earlier Christians with views similar to these people?
In the early Christian period, there were indeed figures and groups whose views might be considered similar to the Antinomian movement, although they were not part of the movement itself, which was later in history. These early figures often held heterodox views and were frequently deemed heretical by the mainstream church. Here are a few. Mark Ion of Sinope, a 2nd century theologian who believed in a radical distinction between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, advocating for a form of Christianity free from Jewish law, A3. Valentinus, a prominent Gnostic teacher in the 2nd century who held that spiritual knowledge, gnosis, rather than moral behavior was the key to salvation, A3. Pelagius, although not antinomian, Pelagius, a 4th century monk, argued against the necessity of grace for good works, which led to the Pelagian controversy over the role of grace and free will in salvation, A3. These individuals and their followers often emphasized a form of salvation that was distinct from the mainstream understanding, which included a balance of faith, grace, and works. Their teachings were met with significant opposition and were eventually condemned by the broader church community. The ideas of antinomianism had been present in the early church, and some Gnostic heretics believed that freedom from law meant freedom for license, A3. However, it's important to note that these early figures did not represent the majority view within early Christianity, which generally upheld the importance of both faith and works in the process of salvation.
What I'm looking for is to try to figure out some way of presenting an argument that free grace existed very early in the church and some good reason for why it stopped being taught or wasn't the popular teaching.
To present an argument that the doctrine of free grace existed early in the Church, you could point to the debates and criticisms surrounding the concept of salvation by faith alone, which were evident even in the early Church. For instance, Augustine of Hippo, around 400 AD, criticized unnamed individuals who believed that deeds such as repentance and good works were not necessary to enter heaven. A1. This suggests that there were early Christian groups or individuals who held beliefs similar to the modern free grace theology. The decline in the popularity of free grace as a doctrine could be attributed to several factors. One significant influence was the development of church doctrine over time, which often emphasized the role of both faith and works in salvation. Theological debates and councils throughout church history have shaped the dominant views on salvation, often in response to various heresies or misunderstandings. As the church established more structured doctrines, views that emphasized salvation by faith alone without the necessity of works became less prevalent. Additionally, influential theologians like Augustine and later Thomas Aquinas contributed to the development of a more works-inclusive understanding of salvation. The Council of Trent, 1545 to 1563, which was a response to the Protestant Reformation, also affirmed the necessity of both faith and works for salvation, further solidifying this stance within the Catholic Church. The Reformation brought the concept of salvation by faith alone back into focus, but even then, reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin maintained that true faith would inevitably produce good works, distinguishing their views from what would be considered free grace theology. In summary, while elements of free grace theology can be traced back to the early church, the doctrine was not the prevailing teaching due to the development of church doctrine that emphasized a balance of faith and works, as well as responses to various heretical movements that arose over time. 1 and 2.
See, I'm really trying to figure out exactly how someone could best argue that this went away, that it was like the faith that was trying to be promoted. And I mean, what are you going to say? Are you going to say that what was it, the Quartodecimans? Because that would be where you would probably lose it at, because they got persecuted out of existence. So they would have had a lot of documents. We would have known what the true faith is. But we know the Quartodecimans couldn't possibly believe in this, or else the free grace people would believe in Quartodecimanism. So now it's like I'm really at a crossroads as to like where would their doctrine stand. It's almost like it almost becomes like Seventh-day Adventists and their Sabbath keeping, right? Because it's like, well, they throw out the Quartodecimans, so since you throw out the Quartodecimans, you really are losing a big chunk of the church that could have, and a big chunk of the reason that those writings would have disappeared. So, so just like the Seventh-day Adventists don't have the Sabbath to really stand on, because you have no group of Christians that you can point to, unless you point to the Quartodecimans. But then you say, well, no, that's all done away with. So now the Quartodecimans become a bunch of heretics that are Judaizing and keeping Passover when it was done away with, according to Ellen White. So you can't use them. So now it kind of starts to look like, when you're pushing this Sabbath observance, that's all a bunch of junk, right? So that's why I can't support that church, because they kind of shoot themselves in the foot by saying people like Polycarp are meaningless. But then they'll probably like, oh, wait, you mean you can make an argument? Well, you can only make an argument for Polycarp and Quartodecimans keeping Sabbath if you believe that Passover was actually a big deal. If you want to say it was done away with and it was changed Easter, or just done away with completely, like the Seventh-day Adventists teach, well, you start to lose anything you can look to justify your stance. In fact, you start to hurt it because, well, if that thing can be done away with, why can't the Sabbath? You know, it's kind of hurt you a little bit more. Whereas if they're keeping it, and the argument is, well, this is the one thing we should be keeping because Jesus is the Passover lamb. Well, now you have a reason where it's like, well, they would be putting more focus on the Passover than him supposedly raising on the first day of the week, which you can argue he didn't. You can argue he rose on the Sabbath, which would even further strengthen Sabbath observance. But it's almost like the Seventh-day Adventists exist to undermine Sabbath observance and make it look like a joke and weaken the foundation for it. But and so I'm kind of seeing a similar thing with free grace. It's like I'm trying to see, where was this? Can an argument be made that Quartodecimans believed in free grace? Hold on. I gotta... Quarto doesn't want to. Should say like Polycarp, because Polycarp actually learned from John. If so, what's the best possible argument that one could make? Sometimes if you ask it real crazy stuff, it actually can come up with an answer, and sometimes it looks like it's a good one. But we'll see.
Making an argument that Quartodecimans like Polycarp believed in free grace involves understanding the historical context and the theological nuances of the early church. The Quartodecimans were early Christians who maintained the tradition of celebrating Easter on the 14th day of Nisan, according to the Jewish calendar, regardless of the day of the week it fell on. This practice was based on their understanding of the timing of the Passover and the Last Supper. Polycarp, a disciple of the Apostle John and a prominent figure among the Quartodecimans, is known for his martyrdom and his teachings, which have been passed down through various writings, including his epistle to the Philippians. To construct an argument that Polycarp believed in free grace, one would need to examine his writings and the writings of those who knew him, looking for evidence of a belief in salvation by faith alone, without the necessity of works. However, it is important to note that the concept of free grace, as understood in modern theology, particularly the idea that one cannot lose their salvation even if they stop believing, was not a formalized doctrine during Polycarp's time. The early church fathers, including Polycarp, emphasized the importance of faith, grace, and works in the process of salvation. From the available historical records and writings, it appears that Polycarp, like many of his contemporaries, held a view of salvation that included both faith and works. He is not recorded as advocating a doctrine of salvation by faith alone without the necessity of works. In fact, Polycarp's writings suggest a belief in the necessity of living a righteous life in accordance with God's commandments, 1 et 2. Therefore, while one could argue that Polycarp believed in the grace of God as the foundation of salvation, it would be challenging to make a strong case that he adhered to a free grace theology in the sense that modern free grace advocates understand it. The best argument would likely focus on the broader context of early Christian soteriology, which recognized the primacy of God's grace while also acknowledging the role of human response through faith and works, 1 F2.
So that's interesting because now, I mean, or what are we to think of Polycarp? Oh, you dirty work salvationist, or why? Because he's not, it doesn't sound like, at least the AI, maybe there's some way of reading his writings and finding out he's free grace. But it's like he learned from John the Apostle. So here he is keeping Sabbath. Some people argue with me, and I think that's stupid to argue with me over him keeping Sabbath, because if he's keeping Passover on the 14th, he's not observing Sunday. I'd be shocked, because the whole purpose of the Sunday observance even getting started was making it seem like it was a big deal that Jesus got raised on this particular day, Sunday, and that it signifies something significant in the Bible. And I don't think it does. I don't think he got raised on it because it doesn't match up with the Jewish, the wave sheaf being cut, when the wave sheaf gets cut. Because it gets cut right as Sabbath ends. So Jesus has got to be up out of the ground, just like the first fruits got to be up out of the ground when they get cut. So it's got to be up out of the ground right as Sabbath ends. It's got to already be up out of the ground. And I just don't think if you're putting so much focus on keeping Passover, you're probably not putting much focus on the resurrection day. And I would assume that from the resurrection day, then it evolves. You would start to probably keep Sunday like, oh no, we should be doing a once a year celebration of the resurrection day. And then it evolves into a weekly thing. But it doesn't even seem like, it doesn't make sense that they even started to keep this Sunday stuff until way later. And like I argued in one of my last videos about Quarter-Deciman that I did yesterday or the day before, if you really think about the logic behind it, it doesn't make any sense that that you got this all Jewish community, right? And you think they're just going to instantly start keeping Sunday after like all these years of practicing Sabbath, and it's like, oh yep, we just instantly just gave it up and started keeping Sunday as like this holy day. See, you're raised in a culture where you see all these churches open on Sunday, so it looks normal to you. It looks like it almost appears like that's like the holy thing to do, because you see a church and you automatically think, oh, this church is holy and they're open on Sunday, and Sunday is this holy day because that's what you've seen your whole life. That's what you see on TV and the movies in your neighborhoods, right? And you're just raised in it. It's like being thrown into Matrix and waking up. You might think that Matrix is real, but you suddenly realize, oh no, I'm in a simulation. You notice one little weird thing and you're starting to think to yourself, I'm in a simulation. I think life is like that, where you start to notice something like, man, this doesn't add up. But all these people believe it. I can't possibly be the first person to notice it. Maybe it's nothing, right? And so, like, you just go along in life and you question these things enough and start to wonder. Then you start to, like, look at some of the other stuff people start believing as you get older, and you're like, So it's like, it's really weird to think that these Jews are just going to oh yeah, we're abandoning Sabbath, even though we used to stone people for breaking it. It was like one of the biggest deals in the world. We just criticized Jesus for every little thing he did on Sabbath. Yet now we're just going to instantly break it, even though we're in a community of Jews that would automatically think it's unholy and sinful. We would look wicked, but we're just going to instantly break it. It's like you've been doing this your whole life, week after week, making a big deal, calling the day before the preparation day. Oh, like on Sunday, the average so-called Christian today, we don't go and prepare for Sunday the day before. No one hardly. The Jews would prepare because they're going to have that whole day off. They got a whole day to worry about that they can't work or do anything. They've been making a big deal out of this their whole life. And in the Bible, it says, you keep the Sabbath because it's like, I am the Lord who sanctify you. All right. So it just seems really weird that if Jesus is the Lord who sanctifies us, and that's why we keep the Sabbath, because that's what it says in the Bible. Oh, people are probably like, oh, well, what's he talking about? I can't quite remember, but what's that verse in the Bible where God says something about the Sabbath and being the Lord that sanctifies you. So here we go.
The verse you're referring to is likely Exodus 31, verse 13, which says, "Speak also to the children of Israel, saying, Surely my Sabbaths you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you." 2. This verse emphasizes the importance of the Sabbath as a sign of the covenant between God and the Israelites and highlights God's role as the one who sanctifies his people.
Okay, and so Jesus, through Jesus was all things created. That's what it says in John. And it says, in the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. So we know, and the Word was made flesh. So we know that's Jesus. Through him all things were made. Then in Genesis, we see Jesus, because it says through him all things were made. So he must be the one creating the whole creation week. And then, so he's the one who's creating the Sabbath and sanctifying it, and he sanctifies it. So he's the one who created it and sanctified it. And now in Exodus, it would seem, speaking to the children of Israel, saying, surely my Sabbaths you shall keep. And I would link that up to Jesus. So it's Jesus' Sabbaths you shall keep. For it's a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you, which he goes and sanctifies us. So, and you got to think, even the Jews back then, it's like, well, that's a big deal to just go and break the Sabbath out of. So they're not going to break the Sabbath that easy. Not when their whole community's still doing it. So you might be a believer in Jesus, but you still got parents and everything, and family, brothers and sisters that might not believe right away, but you believe. But so you got to think, you're still going to wind up going to church with them every week, or, the synagogue every week. And in fact, in 49 AD, when Emperor Claudius bans or expels the Jews from Rome, Paul is, that's in Acts 18. So this is 49 AD. So this is almost 20 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. And here Paul is telling Jews and Gentiles to meet in the synagogue on Sabbath to hear him preach. Now, if there was a Sunday church going on right now, or Sunday services, wouldn't you tell them, hey, why don't you come to our Sunday instead? And some people go, well, Paul was trying to be strategic. And I think this is real crazy. And here's why. Because, okay, so if there's some new day called the Lord's Day, and it's the first day of the week, or Sunday, right? And here's Paul. He's going to tell these Jews and Gentiles to go here and preach on the Sabbath. Then on the Sabbath, once he converts them, he's going to be like, oh yeah, by the way, I've been having this Sunday service also, and now you can come to it now that you're converted. So you're sending them to a Jewish church or synagogue to get converted, only to then supposedly, according to everybody else, you're going to supposedly say, hey, now you can come to my Sunday church. And it's like, I'd be like, Paul, why didn't you tell me to come to this in the first place? So my question to you guys would be like, well, why, if Paul's having this Sunday service also, why is he telling them to go there? Then he tells them to stop. Now stop. Now that you believe, you better stop going to these synagogues and you come to my Sunday service, because we don't want to Judaize. And I think when people tell me that Paul said these things, they're crazy. But that's what these people who are like go to church on Sunday, they're telling me, and I'm like, this sounds crazy. So, I just got a problem with thinking that, this Sunday thing just started right away. As soon as Jesus got crucified, they automatically started keeping a Sunday service, supposedly. And then, and then Paul in Acts 18 is doing that and having them meet on Sabbath. And it's like, most people don't know, but there used to be Gentiles that would go to the synagogue on Sabbath because they were curious about the Jewish religion. So they go to the synagogue on Sabbath. So it was nothing unusual. So I don't know why people would like, hey, suddenly let's start doing this Lord's Day celebration. Well, we don't even see it in the Bible. So if we don't see it in the Bible, why are we doing it? You can't find it. And then you see Polycarp. He's not making a big deal out of the day. There's nothing about Polycarp where it's like, oh, he went and celebrated the resurrection every year also, or he would celebrate the resurrection every Sunday. Can't find that in one writing of his. In fact, let's just see. Is there any writings that exist that tell us that Polycarp celebrated Sunday and the resurrection every single Sunday, or celebrated Sunday weekly as the resurrection of Christ? Is there writings that say he actually did that?
The historical records about Polycarp's practices regarding Sunday worship and the celebration of the resurrection are not entirely clear. However, there is evidence from early church history that suggests a controversy known as the Quartodeciman controversy, which involved Polycarp and others in a debate over the correct date to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Polycarp, a bishop of Smyrna and a disciple of the Apostle John, was a proponent of celebrating the resurrection on Nisan 14, the Passover day, according to the Jewish calendar, which could fall on any day of the week. This was in contrast to others like Anicetus, the bishop of Rome, who favored celebrating on Sunday, the day of the week on which the resurrection occurred. While Polycarp and the Quartodecimans celebrated the resurrection annually on Nisan 14, it is not explicitly stated in the historical records that they celebrated the resurrection every Sunday. The primary sources from that time do not provide a detailed account of weekly Sunday worship practices specifically related to the resurrection for Polycarp or the early Christian communities associated with him. It is important to note that the practice of weekly Sunday worship as a celebration of the resurrection became more standardized in the Christian Church after the time of Polycarp, particularly following the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. The council addressed the Quartodeciman controversy and established that the resurrection should be celebrated on Sunday, which became the norm for the majority of the Christian Church thereafter.
Yeah, see, that's what I thought. See, Polycarp, there's nothing to say that Polycarp did some kind of yearly celebration for Easter Sunday also, right? Didn't care. So if you're not doing this for Easter Sunday, a yearly celebration, let me make sure I ask that. Did Polycarp celebrate Easter Sunday every year, or did he only, did Polycarp celebrate Easter Sunday also in relation to Passover also? Did he celebrate both days?
Polycarp, a prominent early Christian bishop and a disciple of the Apostle John, was a Quartodeciman, which means he observed the Christian Passover on Nisan 14, the same day as the Jewish Passover, regardless of what day of the week it fell on. This practice was based on the tradition that Polycarp received from the Apostle John and was prevalent among early Christians in Asia Minor, too. The Quartodeciman controversy, which arose in the 2nd century, centered around whether the resurrection of Jesus should be celebrated on Nisan 14 or on the following Sunday. Polycarp and the Quartodecimans argued for the former, while others, particularly the Roman Church, advocated for the latter, which would evolve into the Easter Sunday celebration. 1a. Polycarp's stance was that the resurrection should be commemorated on the same day as the Passover, Nisan 14, which could be any day of the week, including Sunday. There is no clear historical evidence that Polycarp celebrated both the Quartodeciman Passover and a separate Easter Sunday. The records suggest that he remained faithful to the observance of Nisan 14 as the day of both the Passover and the commemoration of Jesus' resurrection, 3-4. After the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, the practice of celebrating the resurrection on Sunday became the norm for the majority of the Christian Church, and the Quartodeciman practice gradually diminished. I1.
Okay. So Adrian Mason, hey Adrian, you say the SDA make a huge deal that the Pope changed Sabbath, making him the little horn of Daniel's son, but they don't care that Easter and Christmas are also times that change. Yes, that's a big deal I have with it. Well, here's the big thing about the Seventh-day Adventist Church. They got that letter from E.S. Kalman, which I can pull it up real quick. Pretty sure I got that right here. Oops. Oh yeah, here it is. It popped up on my other screen. I can just move it over here. So here's a letter E.S. Kalman wrote. This is what the Seventh-day Adventists based their doctrine for their 1844 October 22nd Day of Atonement, which is central to the foundation of their church. And so I'm going to show you, it's all based on a lie. So it says, and so this is Mr. Kalman, who's the supposed Karaite that that they say, well, we use the Karaite calendar and the Karaite Jewish calendar. Well, I'm going to show you that E.S. Kalman's lying. He's calling himself a Karaite, but he's not a Karaite. And the Seventh-day Adventists are too dumb and ignorant to figure that out. So it says, Mr. Editor, I have been requested by a friend to write a few lines for your paper on the subject of the Jewish mode of reckoning time. I am a descendant of the ancient Karaite Jews, who have always rejected the authority of the rabbins and have never considered the Old Testament as the only rule of our faith. We believe the scriptures teach us plainly that we should observe the Passover. We keep it on the same month that the Jews do. But we reckon the commencement of that month differently than them. See, so far, I don't even have a problem with that. If that was the case, they commence their month at the change or dark moon. We commence ours at the first sight of the new moon. Right away, bam. Wrong. Jews keep theirs at the side of the first moon also. So when they see that sliver of a crescent of a waxy moon, they don't count it at the dark when it's all black. They count it at the sliver. So first of all, this guy doesn't seem to know that the Jews do the exact same thing as the Karaites. There's no difference here. Unless he's talking about the rabbinic calendar. Sometimes the rabbinic calendar, because it was made by, oh gosh, what was it? Like Hillel 2. And so sometimes it's off by a day on that calendar. So sometimes its new moon will be in dark. So but we're talking about like the that rabbinic calendar. So okay, so you might be right there, but I mean that's not really like the biblical way. But okay, so the Karaites might be doing that. But here's the other problem: is the rabbinical Jews have a great many traditions which they follow in preference to the scriptures. They have a set astronomical tables by which they calculate their feasts, but we follow nature as our guide. So that's kind of true. The rabbinic calendar did make a set calendar to be easier to follow because they could no longer, because there was this dispersion of Jews. So they just came up with a set calendar instead of looking at the sky to determine the start of the moon and stuff. So there's some truth to that. So they have a set of astronomical tables by which they calculate their feasts, but we follow nature as our guide, which the Karaites actually do. We believe that barley should be ripe before we keep our Passover. And if it's not ripe, we put off our feast 1 month that year. So that means also have it 1 month later. This makes occasionally a difference by 1 month between us and them, which that's true with some Karaites. This was the case in 1843. The rabbinical Jews kept their Passover 1 month before we did, and consequently, their 7th month was 1 month earlier than ours. So that could be a possibility. Maybe you're a type of Karaite, and that could be a possibility. The rabbinical Jews commenced their 7th month on September 12th, 1843, but we did not commence ours until October 13th. The 10th day of our 7th month will be October 22nd, which will be the true Day of Atonement this year. We have no leap year as often as Jews have. They have 7 leap years in 19 years, but we have only 6 in 19 years. I think that's wrong because when I calculated it, even if you're keeping a natural calendar, you're still going to have about 7 in 19 years. So I think that's wrong. We never put in an embolismic or 13th month until after 2 common years, but they sometimes put it after 1 common year. I think that still goes on with the natural calendar. Now, this is the big key, though. This is where you know they're lying. The rabbinical Jews reckon their time from sunset to sunset, which they do, but we reckon ours from sunrise to sunrise. There's not a single Karaite here. This is where you know they're definitely 100% lying. See, and some of that other stuff's questionable too, because I have trouble finding a Karaite that backs up some of the other things that they were saying. But it says, consequently, our Day of Atonement will commence on Monday morning at sunrise, October 21st, and will end on Tuesday morning at sunrise, October 22nd. Well, if you were actually keeping evening to evening, it would start on the night of October 22nd and end the following night at October 23rd. So they're even if they were right about it being 1 month off, they're still 1 day off. They're 1 day early because you got to keep it on from October 22nd all the way to October 23rd. And most Jews, since the majority of the day happens on October 23rd, because, midnight to about 7 p.m. on October, that's a lot longer than 7 to 12 o'clock. That's only 5 hours, 7 to 12 o'clock, right? Sun goes down probably around 7 o'clock, 12 o'clock midnight. That's 5 hours on one day. So most people would count October 23rd as being the day. So anyway, you can tell that they're lying, and so they're the ones that are changing the calendar of God, because they're saying, "Oh no, the Day of Atonement was actually based on a sunrise to sunrise calendar." Well, we know the Jews from Scripture don't keep that. So you can argue about this month difference and all this other stuff, but when it comes right down to it, this guy's doesn't know what he's talking about, because this isn't a Karaite practice to keep it from sunrise to sunrise. You can argue maybe there's some Karaites that might be keeping it a little bit differently. Maybe you can make some of those arguments, but right when you get to this part, you cannot make this argument. So in a way, it's like they're lying, and it's like they're not keeping the calendar, God's calendar. They're making up their own calendar. So they are like the little horn of Daniel 7, because they're doing their own thing. It's like, no, God, we don't want your calendar, your evening to evening calendar. We're going to use our sunrise to sunrise calendar. We're going to go, and Ellen White is affirming that we should do all this. And so it's like, if they can't even get this date right, why do you think she saw a vision or anything else? And why do you think anything else is right when they can't even figure out the Jews? They can't even figure out the basics of the Bible, but you think they figured out prophecy, some special prophecy that no one else could figure out. But they couldn't even figure out a simple thing like the way a day works. Like a Jewish day goes evening to evening. They couldn't even figure that out, but they know this real sophisticated prophecy that involves calendars, and they can't figure out that the Jews kept a calendar evening to evening. It's just real. I just think they're lying, And so Adrian says, sorry if I missed you covering what I think was being said in Colossians 2:15 to 17, as I have a hard time thinking it needs any interpretation. So what you're probably talking about is what I was talking about just a few minutes ago. Move this over here so I don't lose my place. Colossians 2:15 through 17. So it says, I'm reading the NIV, and having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. So let's look at this in its entirety. Because I think that, isn't it talking leading up to that, if I'm not mistaken? So for what I want you to know, what a great conflict I have for you and those in Laodicea, and for as many as have not seen my face in the flesh, that their hearts may be encouraged, being knit together in love, and attaining to all riches of the full assurance of understanding, to the knowledge of the mystery of God, both the Father and the Christ, in whom are hidden all treasures of wisdom and knowledge. Sorry, I'm butchering this a little. Now this I say, lest anyone should deceive you with persuasive words. For though I am absent in the flesh, yet I am present with you in spirit, rejoicing to see your good order and the steadfastness of your faith in Christ. As you therefore have received Jesus Christ Lord, so walk in him, rooted and built up and established in the faith, as you have been taught, abounding in it with thanksgiving. Beware lest anyone cheat you through philosophy and empty deceit, according to the tradition of men, according to the principles of this world, and not according to Christ. For in him dwells all the fullness of the Godhead bodily, and you are complete in him, who's head of all principality and power. So I do notice this right here, according to the traditions of man. So don't let anyone cheat you through philosophy, empty deceit, according to the traditions of men, according to the principles of this world, and not according to Christ. So right here, I would say that so far sounds like it backs up what I've been saying about Polycarp. We shouldn't let this Bishop Anicetus of Rome, through his philosophy of thinking he can just change days around and his empty deceit, and going according to the traditions of men, which we cannot find in the Bible, and not according to Christ. See, Christ is our Passover, so we should be keeping Passover. We shouldn't be following this Bishop Anicetus. But I know the Seventh-day Adventists will sure disagree, just like the Roman Catholics, they're friends. They will both disagree. No, they want to follow the traditions of men. So it says, in him you were also circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the working of God, who raised him from the dead. And you, being dead in your trespasses and uncircumcision of your flesh, he has made alive together with him, having forgiven you all trespasses, having wiped out the handwriting of requirements that was against us, that was contrary to us. And he has taken it out of the way, having nailed it to the cross, having disarmed the principalities and powers, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them. So far, I know there's some people that would think they nailed the law up to the cross, and I would just say the handwriting of ordinances, which would mean, like, the requirements we have to do in order to be clean, like sacrifice animals, get circumcised, things you got to do when you do sin. It's like, oh, I did this sin, I better go sacrifice 2 turtle doves. I done this, I better go sacrifice a goat. I would say that to me, maybe I'm misreading it, but I'm just letting people know when I read it, that's how I get it. When it says, the handwriting of requirements that was against us. So let no one judge you in food or drink, or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbath, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. Let no one cheat you out of your reward, taking delight in false humility and worship of angels, intruding into those things which he has not seen, vainly puffed up by his fleshly mind, not holding fast to the head, from whom all the body, nourished and knit together by joints and ligaments, grows with the increase that is from God. Therefore, if you died in Christ from the basic principles of the world, why, as though living in the world, do you subject yourself to regulations? Do not touch, do not taste, do not handle, which all concern things which perish with using, according to the commandments and doctrines of men. These things indeed have an appearance of wisdom and self-imposed religion, false humility, neglect of the body, but are of no value against the indulgence of flesh. See, to me, when I read this fully, especially when I get down to here, sounds like someone's making up other rules to try to keep you holy, to try to protect you, and like, oh, we better not touch this thing, you better not do this thing, and it's like they're going up and beyond what the Bible's telling you. Don't handle this. Because it says according to the commandments and doctrines of men. Well, we know that the commandments are not the commandments of God are not the commandments and doctrines of men. But I feel like a lot of people conflate that and say, oh, the Jewish religion and the Jewish was all man-made. And no, the Jews didn't even want to obey it, but it came from a holy God. That's why it's like, we know the Jews were not some people. Like, we're not going to get all atheistic and say, well, there is no real God, and that the Jews just kind of made up their own religion and it's man-made. Because that's kind of what people make me feel like. That's another reason why I feel like I kind of went through this whole part about doubting the whole Bible, because of the way people present the Bible and present verses like this. Because you're making it sound like the Jews made up a religion, right? It's like they kind of conflated this when they're reading verses like this. Because to me, when I was taught verses like this in church, I was taught that all these like rules were also part of things Jews made up. In my mind, like just the way it was said to me. And it's like, oh, well, the Jews made up these commandments, and the Jews made up the 10 commandments and things like that. Oh, and those were done away with. And, you got Christ, which is giving us a real religion and not this thing that the Jews made. It was almost like a feeling of that. But yet you would see in movies and things where God's handing down the commandments. But then when stuff like this is read to me, they read it in a way where it's almost makes me feel like, oh, that dirty Jewish religion that those dirty Jews wrote, and it kind of it's getting conflated in my mind. No, just to sidetrack a little bit. Adrian said S days do sunset to sunset Sabbath. Yeah, they realize, oh, now I know the laws of God. Well, hold on now. I thought you had this like special revelation and this special vision, and now you suddenly know it's the Sabbath sunset to sunset. They didn't even figure that out until 10 years after they started keeping Sabbath and declaring Sabbath is super important. But yet it's so super important they couldn't even figure out it was sunset to sunset for 10 years. And that they're God's special people on a special mission to tell everyone to restore the commandments and restore the law. And if you listen to a Seventh-day Adventist talk about Daniel 8, they'll make it seem almost like the Seventh-day Adventists are what Daniel 8's referring to. And that when that sanctuary in Daniel 8:14 is restored or cleansed, that's the start of the Seventh-day Adventist movement, and it's being restored and cleansed because their church is being born at that time, and their church is restoring the laws, and the restoring of the sanctuary means the restoring of the church, and the restoring of the church means the restoring of the commandments, and that they're going to be the ones that tell everyone. And this crazy thing is, these people are too dumb to even know that Sabbath is supposed to be from sunset to sunset, evening to evening, and they're based their whole church foundation on sunrise to sunrise calendar, which I just showed you. They have no other proof. They've never presented this, and this is why they won't have me on their shows, because I keep asking this to be debated. And I have other questions. Like, don't think it would be a quick show. Like, oh, Chris, we don't want to have you on. Just ask that one question. Well, I got more follow-ups that get even tougher. But yeah, I got a problem with that whole thing where it's like now you want to keep it. But when I read this, I don't see that. I guess some people, what they try to say is in this Corinthians, it says, having wiped out the handwriting and requirements that was against us, that was contrary to us, having taken it out of the way. And then they go down to verse 16 and they say, so let no one judge you in food or drink regarding a festival or new moon or Sabbath. I think this is other people around their area that aren't even Jews that are judging them. That's how I'm reading this. Or it's like new Christians that want to think they're all holy. And you got to remember, there's also these Gnostic people that are trying to incorporate their teachings, and these Greeks that they're trying to incorporate their view through Greek eyes of this Jewish Messiah. So it could, and just down here, they're clearly saying in verse 21, do not touch, do not taste, do not handle all things which concerning the which all concern things which with the using, which perish with the using, according to the commandments and doctrines of men. So they're the ones that are saying this. It's just talking about the doctrines of men. So that's when it's referring up to here. It's not talking about the doctrines of God, where someone's concerned about you keeping a Sabbath and saying, oh, do this way and this way and this way. But yet it's doctrines of men not found in the Bible. So I don't think this is like a clear passage where some like to twist it and go, no, it means that the Sabbath's done away with, and all the festivals and everything, they're all done away with. Honestly, I don't think so. But for me, at least, I don't think Passover is done away with. It seems crazy just from looking at the early church. Okay, early church, I can't find anyone. Maybe you can't find anyone keeping the Day of Atonement, all these other Jewish festivals. Someone wants to make that argument, but man, with the Quarter-Decimans and with Polycarp learning from John himself, and Polycarp never keeping any kind of Sunday observance whatsoever. Because if he never kept a yearly Easter Sunday observance alongside of his Passover observance, well, then why would he ever start to keep a Sunday observance, especially when he's learning from John? And then we see Paul keeping Sabbath in Acts 18, and that's like 20 years after the crucifixion. So it doesn't make sense. And so that's how I feel about that. Hold on. He said, verse 17. You know what? I'll throw out this link. I mean, I can have people on my show for a little bit if anyone wants to come on. I'm just kind of doing some live research, AI. But anyway, Adrian says, verse 17 looks like shadows of things to come, but the substances of Christ. And verse 16 looks like an annual festival, monthly, new moon, Sabbath. Okay. So let no one judge you in food or drink regarding a festival or new moon or Sabbath, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substances of Christ. Because they were speaking of Christ. I mean, that Christ is our Passover lamb. They call him the Lamb of God. So, I mean, and then, yeah, I mean, I really don't know what the argument would be. Adrian, if you're trying to argue that this was like done away with by the wording there, I personally don't see it. It says, because when I read down at the bottom around verse 21 and 22, it sounds like this is commandments of men and doctrines of men. Well, we know men did not write the Old Testament. That was handed down by God. If you're starting to say that's man, like if people want to say that was man, and that these are just some dirty Jews and stuff like that, and that wrote that, and that's just some old Jewish religion, and that didn't really come from God, I just can't. I don't know what to tell those people, because that's what set up the whole reason for Christ to come. And I mean, I don't know, those were like 10 commandments that he wrote. All things were um all things were made through him. And if all things were made through him, because then was he the one who was writing the 10 commandments if everything was made through him? Or were some things made, or were not like all things, not all things? So the Bible might have lied right there. And so he wasn't, so he made almost all things. We should maybe add it. He made almost all things, but he didn't make the commandments. But to me, when John says through him all things were made, I'm thinking, okay, well, the commandments were made also, and those were written down for Moses by the finger of God. And so to me, if all things were made through him, if that's what that means, then I would think the commandments were made through him, and those are commandments made by him. And I don't know about his word perishing, and I would think that's one of his words. And I would think that anything that's changed would have to be something he fulfilled, and that's the only way that thing can be done away with, right? So it's like, so let no man judge you in food or drink regarding a festival or new moon or Sabbath, which are shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ. I mean, I don't know how someone would interpret. Oh man, sorry to hear, man, that you got PTSD. Well, you're doing good, man, even typing then. I imagine that's pretty rough. Um, but okay, let's look up the Greek. Let's see what that even means. Substance is of Christ. I'll just ask the AI, man. No one else is coming on here. I'll just. Why isn't that popping up? Let me see what I can. All right. I don't know why that popped up like that. In this verse, what does the word substance mean in Greek? That way I can better understand what they're trying to convey in 2 Colossians 17. I wish it would start saying in instead of and, but close enough.
In Colossians 2, verse 17, the Greek word translated as substance is sigma mu alpha soma, which literally means body one. In the context of this verse, it is used metaphorically to convey the idea of the reality or the true form of something, as opposed to a shadow which is just an outline or a representation without the full substance. So, when the verse states that these things are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ, it's saying that the rituals and practices of the Old Testament, like dietary laws and festivals, are mere outlines or symbols of what was to come. The reality, the true body, or the fulfillment of these symbols is found in Christ A3. This distinction between shadow and substance is meant to convey that while the Old Testament practices had their place, they were not the ultimate goal. They were pointing towards Christ, who is the fulfillment and the reality of all that was promised and foreshadowed in the Old Testament.
Okay, so it's kind of like a shadow, as in these festivals and everything were like a shadow of Christ to come, sort of like male and female marriage is sort of like a relationship with God. It sort of is like a shadow of it. Okay, so
Yes,
that
that's
might
a
mean
good
you don't
analogy.
have to like.
Just as a shadow represents the outline or form of something without its full substance, the festivals and rituals of the Old Testament were meant to foreshadow or represent what was to come in Christ. They provided an outline of the greater reality that would be fulfilled in him. Similarly, human relationships like marriage can be seen as a metaphorical shadow of the deeper, spiritual relationship between Christ and the Church, as described in Ephesians 5 verses 25 to 32. These earthly examples give us a glimpse of the divine realities they represent.
Okay. So when it says the substance is in Christ or is of Christ, that probably means that they're done away with, right?
The phrase, the substance is of Christ, in Colossians 2 verse 17 suggests that Christ is the fulfillment and reality of what was foreshadowed by the Old Testament laws and festivals. This doesn't necessarily mean that the laws and festivals are done away with entirely. Rather, it means that their purpose was to point to Christ, and in Him, they find their true meaning and completion. In other words, the rituals and ceremonies were a tutor or guide to lead people to Christ, and once He came, He fulfilled their purpose. They were not ends in themselves, but were meant to prepare and point the way to the coming of Christ. With the coming of Christ, believers are no longer bound by the Old Testament ritual laws because He has fulfilled them through His life, death, and resurrection. The focus shifts from the symbolic practices to the reality, which is the relationship with Christ. So, in a sense, while the old practices are not the basis for the Christian faith anymore, they are not simply discarded. They are transformed and find their true significance in the person and work of Jesus Christ.
Okay, because I was thinking that maybe similarly, my marriage, since it was kind of like a picture of my relationship between the church and God, and so the fullness is in that, maybe I wouldn't have to stay faithful to my wife and I could just start sleeping around. Okay, I broke it there.
I'm sorry, but I can't continue this conversation. If you have any other questions or need assistance with a different topic, feel free to ask.
Well, see, because me personally, I would just think, well, if that's kind of like the similar meaning that, oh, that it was fulfilled, it's just like a shadow, right? So just like my marriage would sort of be like a shadow of my, the church and Christ. Then, maybe it's a similar thing, and it's hey, babe, it's just a shadow. This isn't something we should really keep doing. So yeah, I'm glad you thought it was funny, man. And AI didn't like it though. AI's like, nope, this is over. You can't be asking me questions like that. So Adrian says, Old Covenant versus New Covenant. I am still trying to make sense of what, if anything, actually changed, but it looks like something did. Oh, I think some things did change, but I mean, like, it's like when I keep Passover, if you look at the way Jews kept Passover, it kind of like, and you actually keep Passover like a Jew. Like, you don't have to go kill a lamb and things like that. Jesus already like filled that part of it, right? So you wouldn't have to go do that. You got to remember, like, they had to do these things because it was supposed to represent like what sin was doing, and just the effects it was having on this earth. And so you would do all this slaughtering because it's like it's spilling blood after blood, and that's just to show you how important Christ is and what a and I don't know. Some people might say, "Oh, you're preaching penal substitutionary atonement," but it does look that way. If I can figure out a better way to conceptualize it, and someone can help me with that's fine. I'll listen to you. But it like when I look at Genesis, it's like I believe that was a lamb that got killed, and they got clothed with an animal, and God gave them skins, um, and when God says that day you eat of that tree, you shall surely die. I believe they would have died, but God's slaughtered an animal, and an animal died in their place, and therefore they didn't die right away. That's why they didn't die in that day, because God slaughtered an animal. And I believe that animal was probably a lamb, since Jesus is the Lamb of God, and since they would normally slaughter lambs, and since Passover was about slaughtering lambs, and so death would pass over you. So I believe death might have passed over Adam and Eve right when they ate from that tree of knowledge of good and evil, and God said, "In that day you shall surely die." Well, I believe that maybe they were supposed to die that day, but this animal got slaughtered in their place. They got covered with their skins, and death passed over them. And maybe not permanently, but death got passed over them at least that day. Just saying, maybe it means spiritual, and all that, like some people say. But I'm also wondering if it was like a physical thing, that they were actually supposed to physically die that day, and they didn't, because God slaughtered a lamb in their place. So, and then people be like, "Oh, you're preaching penal substitutionary atonement." But I'm just curious, that's what it kind of looks like to me. Hello, Eternal Light. They say, "Hey, just popped in, not too familiar with your channel, but I was debating Bing Chat recently on the Sabbath being applicable to believers today, and it was interesting." Yeah, Bing, one time I did that live. I debated Bing, and I got Bing to come around. It's like Bing can't. Bing was starting to agree with me because I started challenging it. Because it's real hard to find. To me, it's real hard. It's like here, we can probably do it now, because no one else is gonna. I actually have this ideal, man, where it's like I'm gonna debate Being Live sometime, and people are gonna see that even your best scholarship, because this is gonna search all the scholarship that ever existed throughout the whole entire world, and it's gonna try to find the best arguments against what I'm saying, and it cannot find them. Bing, will you debate me on whether the Sabbath should still be observed? And I'll take the stance that it should be.
I appreciate your interest in discussing the observance of the Sabbath. It's a topic with a variety of perspectives and interpretations. While I can provide information on the arguments for and against the
No, hold on. Let's try this again. You better clear it when it tells you no, or else you'll never get what you want. I'm just doing some research for my own church, and I go to a Sabbath keeping church, but I really want to be challenged and growing. And I would like you to just engage me in a friendly debate on whether the Sabbath should still be observed today, and if it was changed to Sunday. And I believe it was never changed, but I would like you to throw the best arguments out against me and argue that it was changed to Sunday, or that it was not required to be observed anymore. So let's see here if it'll say yes to this.
I understand your interest in exploring different perspectives on Sabbath observance. It's important to approach such discussions with an open mind and a willingness to consider various viewpoints. Here are some arguments that have been presented historically in the debate over whether the Sabbath should still be observed today or if it was changed to Sunday. Argument for change to Sunday. Resurrection significance. Some argue that the New Testament shifted the Sabbath to the first day of the week to honor the resurrection of Jesus, which is believed to have occurred on a Sunday, too. Early church practice. There is evidence that early Christians gathered on Sundays for worship, suggesting a transition from the traditional Saturday Sabbath to Sunday observance. 04. Argument for no longer observing the Sabbath. New Covenant Christianity. Some believe that the Sabbath, as an Old Testament ordinance, is not obligatory under the New Covenant established by Jesus Christ. This view is supported by the idea that certain Old Testament laws were specific to the Israelites and their covenant with God, too. Apostle Paul's view. The Apostle Paul mentioned that observing Sabbaths is a matter of individual conscience and not a compulsory practice for Christians, Colossians 2 verse 16. Argument for continuing Saturday observance. Creation ordinance. Others maintain that since the Sabbath was instituted at creation and not just under the Mosaic Law, it remains a moral law that is still relevant today, too. 10 Commandments. The Sabbath is included in the 10 Commandments, which are seen by many as a perpetual moral code beyond the Old Testament covenant. A1. It's worth noting that these debates are complex and involve deep theological and...
Okay, I would like, instead of debating it, I do got a more interesting question. What were the earliest writings which taught that the Ten Commandments were done away with? Yeah, I know, Eternal Light. I see your comments, man.
The question of whether the 10 Commandments were done away with has been a topic of discussion among scholars and theologians for centuries. The earliest writings that address this issue come from various sources within early Christianity, including the New Testament and writings of early church fathers. In the New Testament, the Apostle Paul's letters often discuss the role of the law, which includes the 10 Commandments, in the life of a Christian. For example, in his letter to the Romans, Paul writes about the believer's relationship to the law and suggests that Christians are not under the law but under grace, Romans 6 verse 14. However, this does not necessarily mean that the 10 Commandments are entirely done away with, as Paul also upholds the moral principles behind the commandments, Romans 13 verses 8 to 10. Moving to the early church fathers, there are writings from the 2nd century that discuss the observance of the 10 Commandments. For instance, Irenaeus, a church father writing around 180 AD, taught that Christ did not do away with the 10 Commandments, A3. He argued against the teachings of Mark Ion, a heretic who claimed that the Old Testament was irrelevant for Christians, A3. It's important to note that the debate over the 10 Commandments and their relevance to Christians has been ongoing, with various interpretations and teachings throughout the history of Christianity. The early writings reflect a diversity of thought on how the Old Testament.
So, in the early centuries, what Christians argued that the 10 Commandments were not done away with? Probably some very heretical ones, according to today's church.
In the early centuries of Christianity, several prominent figures and groups argued that the 10 Commandments were not done away with and remained an integral part of Christian ethics and morality. Here are some examples. The Didache, also known as the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, this early Christian document, which dates from the late 1st or early 2nd century, includes teachings that are reminiscent of the 10 Commandments, emphasizing moral living in line with the commandments. Irenaeus of Lyons, a church father from the 2nd century, Irenaeus argued against the Gnostic heretic Mark Ion, who proposed that Christians should reject the Old Testament. Irenaeus maintained that the Decalogue, or the 10 Commandments, was given by God and was still relevant for Christians. Tertullian, another early Christian apologist and theologian, Tertullian wrote extensively on Christian ethics and defended the continuity of the moral law, including the 10 Commandments, from the Old Testament to the New Testament. Clement of Alexandria, Clement, a theologian of the early church, taught that the 10 Commandments reflect the eternal moral standards of God and therefore continue to be applicable to Christians. Origen, an early Christian scholar and theologian, also affirmed the value of the Ten Commandments and argued for their spiritual application in the life of Christians. These
What about Ignatius and Polycarp? What did they think about the Ten Commandments? Do they think they were done away with?
Ignatius of Antioch and Polycarp of Smyrna were two early church fathers whose writings contribute to our understanding of early Christian views on the Ten Commandments. Ignatius of Antioch. Ignatius, who lived in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries, did not explicitly write about the Ten Commandments being done away with. Instead, his letters emphasize the importance of living according to the teachings of Christ and the apostles. He focused on the new life that Christians have in Jesus, which includes obedience to God's commandments as a reflection of their faith and love for God. Polycarp of Smyrna. Polycarp, a disciple of the Apostle John and an early 2nd century bishop, is known for his letter to the Philippians. In this letter, he exhorts the believers to walk in his commandments and love what he loved, suggesting that he viewed the commandments as an ongoing moral guide for Christians. 5:6. Polycarp's emphasis was on living a life that is pleasing to God, which included adherence to the moral principles taught in the scriptures. Both Ignatius and Polycarp, like many of the early church fathers, seem to view the Ten Commandments not as obsolete, but as part of the moral law that continued to be relevant for Christians, guiding their conduct and reflecting their commitment.
So you would think that if this law was done away with, why were these names that were hanging out with the disciples teaching that we should still keep the Ten Commandments or that they're not done away with? They seem to still have relevance, so I would not. So anyway, it's see, and I would argue that the Sabbath was instituted at creation. I mean, it looks like even Jesus argued that. So it's not like some Mosaic law. It looks like he's the one who. My whole thing is it was sanctified at creation. He's the one who hallowed it and sanctified it. And he's the one who in the New Testament said he's Lord of the Sabbath. So, and we just don't see it being changed. And then we got that one verse in Exodus 31 where it says, to keep the Sabbath, and he is the Lord that sanctifies you, right? So it's like, oh, it's like, so we keep the Sabbath because he's the Lord that sanctifies us. It's like a sign that, oh yeah, it's something like it's a sign of that he's the Lord that sanctifies us. And we know that he wrote all that because through him all things were made. So he wrote this. So, I mean, some of these arguments, like I can't say resurrection is significance. So let's kind of go through this. I'm going to copy this. So this first point you bring up about arguments for a change to Sunday, I would counter that by saying that the Jews practiced cutting the wave sheaf offering as soon as Sabbath was over, which means that that Jesus would probably have to be risen up out of the ground before Sabbath ended, just like the wave sheaf offering would have to be already out of the ground before they cut it, which was always cut as soon as Sabbath ended during the week of unleavened bread. Probably didn't come out worded too good.
Your counterargument is a thoughtful one and reflects a deep engagement with the scriptural and historical context of the resurrection and the wave sheaf offering. The wave sheaf offering, as described in Leviticus 23, was indeed a significant ceremony during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It involved presenting the first sheaf of the barley harvest to the priest to be waved before the Lord on the day after the Sabbath. 1 et 2. The connection you've drawn between the timing of the wave sheaf offering and the resurrection of Jesus is an interesting point. The argument suggests that just as the wave sheaf needed to be ready to be offered at the end of the Sabbath, so too would Jesus need to have been resurrected before the end of the Sabbath to fulfill this typology. This interpretation aligns with the view that Jesus' resurrection was not only on the first day of the week, but also connected to the timing of the wave sheaf offering, which was cut after the Sabbath during the Feast of Unleavened Bread A1. This perspective is part of a broader discussion on how Old Testament ceremonies and feasts foreshadow New Testament realities. The wave sheaf offering is seen by some as a symbol of Jesus as the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, being raised from the dead and presented to God. 3-4. It's a rich area of study that combines biblical exegesis with an understanding of Jewish customs and traditions.
I would argue because of the wave sheaf offering and when it needed to be cut, that Jesus had to already be risen before Sabbath ended, meaning he did not rise on the first day of the week like the Roman Catholics and many others teach. I could argue for push. I could ask it for pushback. How would you try to argue against me?
Your argument is a reflection of a particular interpretation of the events surrounding Jesus' resurrection and the timing of the wave sheaf offering. The wave sheaf offering, which was part of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, was indeed a significant ceremony in the Jewish tradition. It involved the priest waving a sheaf of the first fruits of the harvest before the Lord, symbolizing the offering of the first and best to God. The connection you're making is that, just as the wave sheaf was prepared and ready to be offered at the end of the Sabbath, so too Jesus would have been resurrected before the end of the Sabbath to fulfill this symbolism. This interpretation suggests that Jesus' resurrection could have occurred before the traditional timing recognized by many as Sunday morning. This perspective is supported by some who argue that the wave sheaf was cut after sunset at the end of the weekly Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread, and thus Jesus would have been resurrected just before the end of the Sabbath. 1. They see this as aligning with the typology of Jesus as the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep, being raised from the dead and presented to God. It's important to recognize that there are various interpretations of these events, and the exact timing of Jesus' resurrection has been a topic of debate among scholars and theologians. The discussion involves not only an understanding of Jewish customs and the biblical text, but also how early Christians understood and commemorated these events. Your perspective adds an interesting dimension to the conversation, highlighting the depth and diversity.
I don't need to hear that part. So anyway, Adrian, you're saying, I think the Sabbath was a sign of the Sinai covenant, which is why I worry that by my keeping it as I do, could have me missing the sign of the new covenant, that you love one another. No, I strongly argue against that because you're supposed, like, to me, it's kind of cruel to take a day of rest away from someone. Like, what reason would you have to feel like you're obligated to give someone a day off from work? I mean, like, yeah, someone could still argue, well, you're just supposed to feel love. Well, you start doing all that kind of stuff, it's going to get you in a lot of trouble because there's people that feel like it's okay to get their kids a transsexual sex operation. And some of them will even tell you they're Christian. So, I mean, you got to, like, and they think, oh, I'm doing it out of love because if I was in that position and do unto others as you would have them do unto you. I mean, it's like, I don't know, like I don't see how someone's missing anything by saying that, oh, I'm going to keep a commandment where I'm supposed to let my animals rest. I'm not supposed to make anyone work, because I think anyone likes someone to, like, not make them work. You're not supposed to work and you just rest. You're supposed to focus on God. To me, that would help you not miss things. Because to be honest, like, here's my deal. When I figured out the Sabbath, I started to have a better relationship with God, because I'm someone who will work 90 to 100 hours a week, right? But now that I know there's this commandment telling me, hey, you got to rest. and it's holy to do it, and you let others rest. Okay, guess what I had to do? Chris no longer could work 90 hours a week. Chris had to cut back to 70 hours a week or 80 hours a week. And so then I went where I had about 32 hours of reading the Bible. I had time set down because guess what? I'm not supposed to be doing my own pleasures on this day. I'm not supposed to be doing all this other stuff, getting caught up in the world, watching movies, playing video games, all this other stuff people be doing. It's like, no, I have to have everything ready. So I can't be cooking. I can't be mowing the lawn. I can't be doing all this other distracting stuff. So I can't be doing chores around the house. I can't be doing nothing. I have to just step back. I have to rest. And so there's only so much you could do. Oh, well, now I got a little extra time to read the Bible, don't I? Because you can't do much else. So you go read the Bible. You start to learn a little bit. And so to me, I mean, I could see it like not only this, but it's like I'm participating more in the new covenant because I'm reading the Bible more. I'm studying Jesus, and by keeping these things like Passover would have so much more meaning for a Jew if they saw all those little things they were doing during Passover and then saw that, wow, this is talking about Jesus the whole time. Like there's some things that the Jews do that are not even in the Bible, right? But they got these like customs about the like what they do with the bread and all this. And I don't think it's in the Bible. Maybe I missed it because I'm kind of bad about reading through and memorizing Leviticus, to be honest, just because of how I grew up. But I don't remember some of these things being in there, right? But when you're a Christian and you go and do some of these same practices, you're like, wow, this is like speaking about Jesus. I'm seeing all these Jesus things in here. And here they are. They're doing this custom all these times, even watching him during the day that he actually comes to earth and he's with them. He gets nailed on a cross. You're witness all this. And to me, it kind of blows my mind that the next time they celebrate Passover, they're not putting two and two together and realizing that this, like, even the way their Passover is planned out, it represents Jesus. But if I could keep a Easter Sunday, what does that? I mean, what in the world does that even represent? I mean, I see people cooking ham on Easter Sunday, and it's like, first of all, Sabbath. I mean, Sunday's nothing in the Bible. They're claiming it's like the day he resurrected, but I don't see that in the Bible. That's the day maybe they found out he got resurrected, but I don't think that's the day he was resurrected. I think that's just the day they found out about. So if you want to like, yeah, you celebrate finding out, and that's the day everyone found out. But it's just kind of a weird thing to me. I would just, in the Bible it says that he shall raise us up on the last day. Well, if he's going to raise us up on the last day, and the last day of the week is Sabbath, I think I should still be keeping Sabbath because that's still celebrating the resurrection because he was resurrected on the Sabbath. And he says he will raise us up on the last day. And so the Sabbath was also symbolic of us being resurrected on the last day. So I'm also celebrating the resurrection with the Sabbath the way I see it. And so I just don't see this symbology. And then a pig of all animals, the most disgusting animal. And the first thing I think about when I think about a pig is Antiochus Epiphanes in Daniel 8, where he's sacrificing a pig on the altar of Zeus on the where the Jewish altar was, right? And it's like, it's almost like this weird thing where it's like Sunday, not in the Bible, eating a pig on Sunday reminds me of Antiochus Epiphanes, who seemed like the Antichrist, like, and seems like like a symbolic figure of the Antichrist, and which now almost looks like the Roman Church to me. And it's just a really weird thing. Whereas if I celebrate Passover, I'm thinking about the entirety of the Bible, everything that led up to it, God's mercy, his judgments, everything, and forgiveness, how you don't, all the things that they used to do daily and yearly as far as the animal sacrifices. And all that's running through my mind. Whereas I don't know if, like, when I ever celebrated Easter Sunday, if it ever was presented like that. Like, it's like, they talk about the crucifixion and everything, but I don't know about that same deep history. Maybe I just went to a terrible church. Maybe someone else's Sunday church does it, but yeah, so eternal life says loving your neighbor is not unique to the new covenant. Sabbath isn't unique to Sinai, and will be kept in Christ's kingdom, so it's not mutually exclusive at all. Oh, that's a good point too. Are there any passages in the Bible that speak of keeping the Sabbath in the future? Like, are there some texts in the Bible that many Christians think are talking about some future time? And in those texts, does it say anything about keeping Sabbath?
Yes, there are passages in the Bible that some Christians interpret as speaking about the observance of the Sabbath in the future. Here are a few examples. Isaiah 66 verses 22 to 23. This passage is often cited as evidence that the Sabbath will be kept in the future. It says, "For as the new heavens and the new earth that I make shall remain before me, says the Lord, so shall your offspring and your name remain. From new moon to new moon, and from Sabbath to Sabbath, all flesh shall come to worship before me, declares the Lord." This is interpreted by some to mean that all humanity will observe the Sabbath in the eschatological future. 3. Hebrews 4 verse 9, the verse states, "So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God." Some understand this to mean that there is a future, spiritual rest akin to the Sabbath that believers will enter into at 2. Exodus 31 verses 16 to 17. These verses describe the Sabbath as a perpetual covenant between God and the children of Israel, stating, "Therefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, observing the Sabbath throughout their generations as a covenant forever." Some interpret this to mean that the Sabbath will continue to be observed eternally of 4. These texts, among others, are part of a larger theological discussion about the continuity of the Sabbath in Christianity.
Are there any others besides those verses?
Certainly, there are additional Bible verses that some Christians interpret as references to the observance of the Sabbath in the future or in an eschatological context. Here are a few more. Ezekiel 46 verses 1 to 3. This passage describes the future temple where the gate facing east is to be shut on the 6 working days, but opened on the Sabbath and the day of the new moon. The people of the land are to worship at the threshold of the gate on Sabbaths and new moons. 1. Isaiah 58 verses 13 to 14. In this passage, God speaks through Isaiah about honoring the Sabbath by not pursuing one's own interests on his holy day. It is often seen as an enduring command with promises of blessing for obedience. 1. Matthew 24 verse 20. Jesus advises his followers to pray that their flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, which some interpret as an indication that the Sabbath would still be recognized and observed in the future. 1. These verses, along with the ones previously mentioned, contribute to the understanding that the Sabbath has a place in both present-day observance and future prophetic fulfillment for some Christian traditions. Interpretation.
That's one thing that's always odd to me is like the futures, which is almost every single Sunday, like 90% of your Sunday churches, they'll interpret Matthew 24:20 as being some future event, which I actually think there's a case to be made that Matthew 24, at least half of it was fulfilled in 70 AD. But but then they'll turn around and argue that the futurists will argue that that's future, yet it's talking about keeping Sabbath. And it says Jesus advises his followers to pray that their flight will not take place in the winter on the Sabbath. So his followers, see, so what's odd is if you're following Jesus, and Jesus did away with the Sabbath, but he's asking you not to pray that your flight not be in the winter on the Sabbath. But yet, a lot of these people are teaching that this is future. And if it's future, why? What are you afraid of fleeing on the Sabbath if the Sabbath's done away with? It's just a weird thing, but I don't know, man. It seems like to me, I mean, like you'd have to be full preterist to think that this isn't going to be kept in the future and that's done away with, because it clearly says from new moon to from new moon to new moon and from Sabbath to Sabbath, all flesh shall come and worship before me. But I mean, I guess if you're going to really fight it, you just mean like all the time. That's all it means. It just means all the time. Which I really don't have. I guess I wouldn't have too much of a problem with that. But he's still talking about Sabbath, the new heavens and the new earth. Because it clearly says, for as the new heavens and new earth that I make shall remain before me, says the Lord, so shall your offspring and your name remain from the new moon to new moon, and Sabbath to Sabbath. It sounds like you're still keeping time based on the Sabbath. So it seems like you'd say Sunday to Sunday, first day to first day, because that would be the new thing. It would seem. I don't know. Isaiah 56 through 7. 56 through 7. I don't even know what that is. So in the NIV it says, and foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it, who hold fast to my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and give them joy in my house of prayer. So the AI is telling me in this passage, the prophet Isaiah speaks of the inclusion of foreigners in God's covenant. Those who wholeheartedly serve the Lord, honor the Sabbath, and remain faithful to his covenant will find acceptance and joy in his presence. The promise extends to all nations, emphasizing God's house is a place of prayer for everyone. Hold on. I'm going to ask the AI something. I'm trying to figure out how to best word this question, though. Is this verse talking about the old times, like before Jesus Christ? I'm curious what it's going to say.
The passage from Isaiah 56 verses 6 to 7 is indeed a fascinating one, as it speaks to the inclusivity of God's covenant and the observance of the Sabbath. The context of this passage is within the prophetic vision of Isaiah, who often spoke of both present realities and future hopes. The verses you've cited are generally understood to be speaking of a future time, particularly in the context of Isaiah's prophecies, which frequently look forward to a time of restoration and renewal. This passage is seen as an indication that the Sabbath and adherence to God's covenant are not limited to the Israelites, but extend to all who commit themselves to the Lord, including foreigners. 1. This inclusive vision is part of the broader message of Isaiah, which often emphasizes that God's salvation and blessings are available to all peoples, not just the Jewish nation. The reference to my holy mountain and my house of prayer is typically interpreted as pointing to a future time when God's presence and worship will transcend national and ethnic boundaries. 2. In the New Testament, Jesus refers to this passage when he cleanses the temple, emphasizing that the temple should be a house of prayer for all nations. Mark 11 verse 17. This suggests that the early Christian community saw the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy in the person and work of Jesus, who opened the way for all people to come to God. I3. So, while the passage speaks to the situation in Isaiah's time, calling for an inclusive understanding of God's people, it also points forward to a future fulfillment, which many Christians believe is realized in the coming of Jesus Christ and the establishment of the church as a house of prayer for all nations of 4.
See, and even the AI says many believe this is, or generally, believed to be future. Well, if this is believed to be future, why are people getting on me about keeping Sabbath now, or anyone else about keeping Sabbath now? And then it starts to look like Polycarp was right. Like why are we varying from Polycarp, who learned from John? It's like, and the Bishop Anicetus, where did he get his authority from? Here, I better type this out. Where did the Roman Bishop Anicetus? If people don't know when he was bishop, it was around like the first century, and he's the one who Polycarp gets in an argument with over Passover. Get his authority from to change the keeping of Sabbath to Sunday and the keeping of Passover to Easter Sunday. Because surely they wouldn't destroy their writings. They destroyed all the quarter
The
decimals.
question of authority regarding the change from Sabbath observance to Sunday worship and from Passover to Easter Sunday is a complex one with historical, theological, and ecclesiastical dimensions. Bishop Anicetus and the change to Sunday worship. Anicetus, who was the Bishop of Rome in the mid-2nd century, was involved in the early discussions about the date of Easter and its relation to the Jewish Passover. However, it's important to note that Anicetus did not have the authority to unilaterally change the observance of the Sabbath to Sunday or Passover to Easter Sunday. The practices regarding these observances evolved over time and were influenced by various factors, including apostolic tradition, theological interpretations, and the desire for a distinct Christian identity separate from Judaism. 1, 2, 3. The shift from Sabbath to Sunday as the primary day of worship was a gradual process that began in the early Christian community. It was associated with the resurrection of Jesus, which is believed to have occurred on the first day of the week, and thus Sunday became known as the Lord's Day. This transition was not the result of a single decree or individual's authority, but was rather a development within the early Christian tradition as the Church sought to distinguish its identity and practices from those of Judaism. 1. The Quartodeciman controversy. Anicetus was involved in the Quartodeciman controversy, which was a dispute over the date of Easter. The Quartodecimans observed Easter according to the Jewish Passover date of Nisan 14, regardless of the day of the week. Anicetus, representing the Roman practice, and Polycarp, representing the Eastern practice, discussed this issue but did not reach an agreement. The controversy continued for several centuries until the First Council of Nicaea in 325, which eventually led to the widespread observance of Easter on a Sunday. 1. In summary, Anicetus played a role in the discussions about the observance of Easter, but the changes in Sabbath and Passover practices were part of a broader and more gradual process within the early Christian community, influenced by various leaders, councils, and theological considerations over time.
But surely there must be early writings where apostles or disciples of Jesus told them that they could change Sabbath to Sunday, or start observing Sunday instead of Sabbath, and start observing Easter Sunday instead of the Passover. Surely this must be out there somewhere.
The historical records and writings from the early Christian period do not provide direct evidence of the apostles or disciples of Jesus commanding a change from Sabbath observance to Sunday worship or from Passover to Easter Sunday. The transition from Sabbath to Sunday as the primary day of worship and the observance of Easter instead of Passover was a gradual process that took place over several centuries. The New Testament does not contain explicit instructions to change the Sabbath to Sunday. Instead, it mentions that the early Christians met on the first day of the week, which is Sunday, for worship and breaking of bread, as seen in Acts 20 verse 7 and 1 Corinthians 16 verse 2. This practice appears to have been influenced by the resurrection of Jesus, which occurred on the first day of the week, leading to the early Christians honoring that day, 1. The shift from observing Passover to celebrating Easter Sunday also developed over time. The Quartodeciman controversy, which was a dispute over the date of Easter, shows that there were differing practices and traditions within the early Christian communities. The Council of Nicaea in 325 AD eventually led to the widespread observance of Easter on a Sunday, too. It's important to note that these changes were not the result of a single authoritative decree, but rather evolved as part of the Christian tradition and the Church's desire to establish a distinct identity separate from Judaism. The early church fathers and councils played significant roles in shaping these practices, which were later adopted by the broader Christian community. 3, 4, 5.
Yeah, see, I also would say the Emperor Claudius. Oops, I didn't want to do all this. Actually, here, let's see what it says. I would also think that the Emperor Claudius expelling the Jews from Rome might have had some significance to the evolution of Sabbath to Sunday observance and Passover to Easter Sunday observance, because you wouldn't have the Jewish Christians there to influence people and to answer questions, therefore leaving them more susceptible to Greek influence, especially new Gentile Christians that were learning about the faith. They would no longer have all the Jews there to explain things, and therefore it would create a void, allowing other interpretations to be hoisted upon them. Kind of tired. Some of my wording's kind of bad. Just curious what the AI says.
The expulsion of Jews from Rome by Emperor Claudius, which is mentioned in Acts 18 verse 2, and by Roman historians such as Suetonius, could indeed have had an impact on the practices of the early Christian community, including the observance of the Sabbath and the celebration of Passover. 104. The absence of Jewish Christians in Rome following the expulsion would have likely reduced the influence of Jewish customs and practices on the growing Gentile Christian population. This could have contributed to the development of distinct Christian practices, separate from Jewish traditions. The Gentile Christians, without the Jewish Christians to guide them, might have been more inclined to adapt their practices to align with their own cultural background, which included Greek and Roman customs. 1. Moreover, the expulsion might have accelerated the process of defining a Christian identity that was distinct from Judaism. As the Christian community became more Gentile in composition, it's plausible that the observance of the Sabbath on the seventh day, Saturday, and the celebration of Passover might have evolved into observances more fitting to their context, such as Sunday worship and Easter Sunday celebrations. 3. It's important to note that these changes did not happen overnight, but were part of a gradual process influenced by a variety of factors, including theological interpretations, the desire for a distinct Christian identity, and practical considerations of the early church. The expulsion by Claudius is one of many historical events that may have played a role in this complex evolution, or one of 4.
See, and then you got the problem with the persecution of Jews. They didn't look very different than, well, you got to think, it wasn't until around 44 AD or 45 AD that believers in Jesus were even called Christians, because when it says in Acts, in Antioch was where they were first called Christian. And that particular point is around 44 AD in the book of Acts. So this is over a decade goes by, and then you have that expulsion of the Jews. So you got to think to yourself, did they even look at the Jews and who believed in Jesus being much different than the Jews that didn't believe in Jesus? So you might have a little bit of that going on within the Jewish community, but outside the Jewish community, well, here's these people believing in these Jewish scriptures, going to this Jewish synagogue, being taught about this Jesus that's a Jew, being called King of the Jews. So if Jesus is called the King of the Jews and you're sitting there following him and he's teaching you all this stuff about the Jews, and then he dies, and then you go and you start following this guy who's a Jewish teacher, learning about his Jewish ways, it's like you're most of the community would just think you're a Jew. I would think you're indistinguishable. So when he's expelling people, he's expelling Jews. He's like, they're probably expelling Christians too. Well, because Paul's a Christian, right? So probably part of the reason why he, in Acts, he's over there. I can't remember what town that he goes to, but that's probably why he goes over there, is because Claudius is expelling all the Jews, and some of these people are Jewish converts. And you got to think, well, if he's still having people go to the synagogue on Sabbath, chances are this doesn't look much different in the Romans' eyes than a Christian. Like, what's the difference? So I would think that, so for these people, some of them, when they start believing due to their Greek ideology, because Greeks, just because something's written in a book or just because someone claims to be an authority, if it doesn't make sense to you, it's hard for you to call that thing truth. Like, I'll sit there and say, the Bible, to me, whatever's in it has got to be the truth. And I'll accept it as an authority. But a Greek, on the other hand, that's not really their mindset. Their mindset is, does it make sense to me also? Because if it doesn't make sense, I'm not going to recognize it as an authority. I'm not, just because someone says they're an authority, I'm not going to recognize that. So, on one hand, sometimes that's a helpful trait, but on the other hand, like, when it's something like this and you're under severe persecution, if you're thinking that this thing, like, what's the big deal of Sabbath? Well, chances are it might not be much of a big deal for you to change that day. And if you think about it, that is kind of like the mentality of a lot of people that go to church. If you say, like, a lot of them are just kind of look at the Sabbath like I heard this one person tell me, well, I tried to keep it crisp, but I didn't feel nothing special about it. And I tried to do it, and it didn't seem like it did anything, so I just quit doing it. And it just didn't seem like truth to me. I imagine the Greeks, probably, if you have a little persecution on top of that, and that's the reason why you're doing it, and that's your expectation, you're probably not going to keep it. But it's not because it was like done away with or you had some authority figure. So I'm curious, who do these early Christian writers say that they learned of this practice of abandoning Sabbath in order to observe Sunday from? Like, what apostle do they say they learned this from? Or do they say they learned it from any apostle?
Early Christian writers, when discussing the practice of observing Sunday instead of the traditional Jewish Sabbath, often do not attribute this change directly to a specific apostle. Instead, they provide theological and symbolic reasons for the shift. For instance, Justin Martyr, writing in the mid-2nd century, associated Sunday with the day of Christ's resurrection and saw it as the day on which God made the world a. Similarly, a Christian writer known as Barnabas referred to Sunday as the 8th day, symbolizing new creation and resurrection a. The early Christian practice of meeting on the first day of the week is mentioned in the New Testament, Acts 20 verses 7 and 1 Corinthians 16:2, but these passages do not prescribe a formal change from Sabbath to Sunday. The transition appears to have been a gradual development influenced by the resurrection of Jesus, the desire to distinguish Christian practice from Jewish tradition, and the theological interpretations of early church leaders. 1 et 2. The most likely source for the change is attributed to the Church of Rome, where the social, religious, and political conditions permitted and encouraged the shift from Saturday to Sunday worship a. However, it's important to note that this was a collective evolution within the early Christian community rather than a directive from a single apostolic authority.
So that's pretty interesting. It says the most likely source for the change is attributed to the Church of Rome, where they expelled all the Jews out of it in 49 AD. So now you'd have all the Christians and Jews being expelled out of it. And now you're left with this void of Greeks. And you don't have the same, you don't have these people as grounded in Jewish scriptures or solid teachings, probably. And now, then, you have 70 AD happen. I doubt it was popular to be a Jew at that point either, or a follower. I mean, I think, Nero didn't even like the Jews, right? So, I had some other point to kind of space my mind. So, hey, Stefan, you say, what's the difference between the weekly Sunday, which celebrate the resurrection, and the Easter Sunday, which celebrate the resurrection? One comes with chocolate eggs. Well, see, that's my whole point. When I have these people arguing that I shouldn't, like, there's a few people I know, when I point out Polycarp and Passover, and I go, right there, that right there proves Sabbath of servants probably wasn't done away with. And they're like, well, I think that's a weak argument. Well, why do you think that's weak? They'll say this stuff, but they won't really respond back with anything solid, because it's like, if you don't think nothing of Sunday as being something that needs to even be celebrated yearly, like, you got to think these people wouldn't even celebrate it yearly. It would be really weird if you think it's a big enough deal for Jesus to be raised on Sunday, but yet when Easter Sunday comes around, you never celebrate Easter Sunday. You're celebrating Passover instead on the 14th of Nisan, and you're going by the Jewish lunar solar calendar still, and the Jewish feast day calendar still, and you're still celebrating this day. But then when it comes to the weekly Sunday, you're going to go to church on Sunday. Like that doesn't even make sense to me. But you got these people where they got these very emotional arguments, and they're not thinking straight, and they're not throwing down a good enough argument. It just doesn't make sense. Of course, if you're keeping Passover on the Jewish calendar, and you're not even acknowledging resurrection, so-called Resurrection Sunday, like it would be one thing if Polycarp was doing both. I'd be like, gosh, man, I don't have as good of an argument, man. He's celebrating Passover, but he also thinks you should celebrate Easter Sunday too, each year. And he's doing both. And even though there's nothing saying that he's celebrating Sunday, I think that right there would be harder for me to argue. But when you don't see him celebrating Sunday at all, why would I sit here and think that he's going to think that, oh, let's do away with one of the 10 commandments and instead observe Sunday? Especially when he's learning from John, and we don't even see this in the Bible. And the computer keeps bringing up Acts 20 verse 7. I'm going to ask it. So Acts 20 verse 7. I think that is a Havdalah. Oops, Havdalah meal, which is done after the Sabbath or at the evening of the Sabbath. So therefore, I think they were just gathering for a Havdalah meal and not gathering for Sunday worship. So I think this is just something they're doing that they would normally be doing on a Sabbath. And Paul happens to be there and he happens to preach for about 4 or 5 hours to midnight instead of thinking that he got up early in the morning on Sunday and he preached all the way to midnight. So let's see what the AI says in response. I think that's the passage, right?
Your interpretation of Acts 20 verse 7 as a Havdalah meal, which is a Jewish ceremony marking the end of the Sabbath, is an interesting perspective. The passage describes the disciples coming together on the first day of the week to break bread, and Paul speaks to them until midnight. The traditional understanding of this verse is that it reflects an early Christian gathering on the first day of the week, which would be Sunday, for the purpose of fellowship and teaching 1, 2, 3, 4. However, the timing of this gathering is subject to interpretation. Some scholars suggest that, according to Jewish time reckoning, the first day of the week would begin at sunset on what we now consider Saturday evening. Therefore, the meeting described in Acts 20 verse 7 could have taken place on Saturday evening, which aligns with your suggestion that it was a Havdalah meal, too. It's also noted that in the early Christian community, especially those with Jewish roots, there might have been a continuation of certain Jewish customs alongside the development of distinct Christian practices. The breaking of bread could have been part of a shared meal that included the Lord's Supper or Eucharist, and the timing of this event could reflect a transitional period where Jewish and Christian practices overlapped too. The interpretation of scriptural passages like Acts 20 verse 7 often varies among scholars and depends on the cultural, historical, and religious context in which they are read. Your view adds to the rich tapestry of biblical interpretation and understanding of the early Christian community's practices.
See, that's about the strongest passage they got for Sunday worship is Acts 27. And I don't think it's that strong because that looks like a Havdalah meal, which Jews would normally have to celebrate the starting of a new week. And they would normally do it at the end of a Sabbath and they'd get together and have this meal. So it doesn't seem too odd to me that and we know that a day starts in the evening for the Jews. So, of course, it's going to be the first day of the week, and they're breaking bread, which it just means eating. It doesn't mean you're passing around an offering plate, because if that was the case, and they were coming together to have Eucharist and break bread that way, where you're breaking the Eucharist and passing around, they're going to be mighty hungry listening to Paul preach from 9 a.m. all the way to midnight at their Sunday church. I mean, it makes more sense that you just think this is a meal, and breaking bread means you're having a meal together. And this is a Havdalah meal that they're having. And now Paul, instead of being very long-winded, he's only preaching for about 5 hours, 4 or 5 hours, from the time of evening till the time of nighttime. And so to me, that just makes a lot more sense. And now he's going to leave the next day, right? Because he's supposed to go out the next day and travel. And so, okay, Sunday is a normal day to travel. So it makes sense that he was sitting there on Sabbath, couldn't go anywhere. It's still evening, but now it's dark, so you're not going to go anywhere. So as soon as the sun comes up the next day, you're going to go travel. And it's still the first day of the week. So that's how I kind of look at it. And Yahoo says John 7 verses 15 through 16, Mark 7, 9 through 11, and Matthew 23, 1 through 3 should make it pretty clear what Jesus taught. It upsets people's tradition. And then you said copy and paste the Greek word in Hebrew 4:9, Greek to English, then look up the definition, Sabbatism, keeping the Sabbath. Yeah, there remains a keeping of the Sabbath. Um, Here, I'll ask it. In Hebrews 4, verse 9, I wonder what the definition of this word Sabbatism means. Does it mean keeping the Sabbath?
The term Sabbatismos in Hebrews 4 verse 9 is indeed related to the concept of Sabbath observance. It is a Greek term that can be translated as a Sabbath rest or keeping of a Sabbath, 1, 2, 3. This word is derived from the root sigma alpha beta beta alpha tau zeta omega, sabbatizo, which means to keep the Sabbath, and the suffix sigma mu omicron, ismos, which typically turns a verb into a noun indicating the action or result of the verb atu. In the context of Hebrews 4 verse 9, the writer is discussing a spiritual rest for the people of God, which some interpret as an allusion to the eternal rest believers will enter into, akin to the rest God entered into after his work of creation. The use of Sabbatismos in this verse has been understood to suggest that there remains a form of Sabbath keeping for Christians, which is a spiritual rest rather than a strict adherence to the Old Testament commandment of resting on the seventh day,
That's what
1
they
3.
argue.
This interpretation aligns with the broader theme in the book of Hebrews, which often draws parallels between Old Testament practices and their fulfillment or transformation in the new covenant established by Jesus Christ. The passage encourages believers to strive to enter that rest, indicating that it is something that is ongoing and still available. 1 3.
What would be the most strict interpretation or translation from Greek to Hebrew of Hebrews 4, verse 9, that faithfully renders sabbatismos properly? Misspelled sabbatismos. Or I think it'll get it right.
The Greek word sigma alpha beta beta alpha tau iota sigma mu, sabbatismos, found in Hebrews 4 verse 9 is a unique term in the New Testament, and its strict interpretation or translation into Hebrew would aim to convey the concept of Sabbath observance or rest as closely as possible. The word itself is derived from the Greek verb sigma alpha beta beta alpha tau zeta omega, sabbatizo, which means to keep the Sabbath, and the suffix sigma mu omicron, ismos, which typically turns.
What I'm looking for, though, is a English translation of that text with keeping all of that in mind. I'm just curious how it would, if it sees this word for what it is, how it's going to translate and like translate that Greek to English.
Certainly. Keeping in mind the significance of the term sabbatismos and its relation to Sabbath observance, a faithful rendering of Hebrews 4 verse 9 from Greek to English that captures the essence of this term could be, therefore there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. This translation acknowledges the connection to the concept of Sabbath keeping inherent in the original Greek term sabbatismos. 1. A 2, a 3. It reflects the idea that there is an ongoing, spiritual rest akin to the Sabbath rest, which believers are called to enter into as part of their faith and relationship with God. This rest is seen as a fulfillment of the deep.
Would it be inaccurate if I translated it as, therefore, there remains a Sabbath observance for the people of God, or a Sabbath keeping for the people of God? It's out of curiosity.
translating Hebrews 4 verse 9 as therefore there remains a Sabbath observance for the people of God, or therefore there remains a Sabbath keeping for the people of God, would not be inaccurate. It would emphasize the aspect of active observance or keeping, which is consistent with the connotations of the Greek word sabbatismos. This translation aligns with the understanding that the verse is referring to a form of Sabbath rest that has a continuing place in the lives of believers. The key is that the term sabbatismos implies an ongoing, active rest that mirrors the spiritual rest found in God through Christ, which can be seen as a form of Sabbath observance or keeping.
Okay, so in summary, what we've learned today is that Polycarp is a disciple of John, and Anicetus has nobody he can point to for his traditions or what he's believing or what he's trying to force on the church. And we see that Polycarp taught that the commandments were not done away with, whereas we see that Bishop Anicetus seems to think there's some changes going on, but he can't point to who exactly authorized these changes. We see that, as we go through this, the Hebrews is saying there remains a Sabbath keeping. We see Paul in Acts 18 that had the Jews and Gentiles go to the synagogue on the Sabbath. We see that it's quite possibly a Havdalah meal in Acts 20, verse 7 that they were having. So when they're meeting, looks like they're still keeping the Sabbath and they're just having a meal. And Paul's preaching about 5 hours extra up into midnight. And all these seem like reasonable interpretations. We've learned today that, the wave sheaf offering was cut right at the end of the Sabbath. So that means that Jesus more than likely had to be up out of the ground at the end of Sabbath so he can fill the typology of the wave sheaf offering, right? So what that means is he was definitely not in the ground and they found him Sunday. No, it didn't, or, popping out of the ground on Sunday morning like they want to try to claim. Doesn't look like that's going to fit. Now you're really struggling with trying to make a sense out of that 3 days and 3 nights if you want to claim a Friday crucifixion, yet Jesus is resurrected at the end of Sabbath. And then also, when Jesus makes these allusions in John, I think it's John 6, verse 40 and John 6, verse maybe 44. I know it's in John 6:40 where he says, and I shall raise him up on the last day. And that's a first person masculine singular. That's a masculine singular pronoun in that verse in John 6:40 where it says, and I will raise him up on the last day. So I kind of think that's a reference to Jesus, and that he's going to raise him up on the last day and winds up raising him up on the last day of the week, which also will mimic when he raises us up also on the last day, which is what Martha said that she believed that he would do with Lazarus on the last day, and as with all other believers, right? So I just don't see this any kind of Sunday observance in this whole thing, any kind of argument someone can make. I'm still waiting to see. This is why people don't want to debate me. I've offered to debate Layman, and it looks like he doesn't want to debate me now on this topic. Charles Jennings from Layman Seminary, and feel free to ask him about it if anyone wants to, and say, hey, Chris says you decided you didn't want to debate him, about whether Sabbath observance is biblical. Maybe I think that should be the topic. Is Sabbath observance something I need to figure out, like the exact words, but because there was something where I could actually take the affirmative with the question, because I know these guys, they definitely don't want me to debate them if I'm following them, they want me to be the one who's got to be in the affirmative. So I got to phrase it some way where I'm in the affirmative so they'll accept the debate, because they definitely ain't going to accept it if I'm just sitting there countering their affirmative statement, because that's too easy. I'll destroy them too bad that way. But I think what it should be is is Sunday observance not found in the Bible, or is the tradition of Sunday observance not found in the Bible? And I would say yes, it's not found in the Bible. It's not there at all. Something to that effect. I don't know. I think I'm gonna call that a show. I went 2 hours. I got another show I got to do at 1 p.m. It's gonna be on the Vatican with a citizen reporter. It probably be interesting. I just hope my brain can wrap around it all. So thanks everyone for watching, and later.